And we're live. Hove said, certain things money can't buy, like being this fly. Back on Maybach Music 1 with Rick Ross. What an absolute bar. And linking in with content creation and how most don't have charisma. You can't buy charisma or being this fly. I mean, look at us.
I don't know what to make of it from your perspective. Least charisma of anyone I know.
There's a company called Sigma OS, which we'll link here and we'll put it on the screen, sigmaos.com. It is a new browser. It has gone through Y Combinator and it won Product of the Month on Product Hunt. 3 technical founders, wonderful founders, one of who I knew before. We knew before, and we put a tiny angel check-in and they said we're doing a party on Friday at the office, and we went to their office, which was nice.
Views in on Hatton Garden, yeah.
Penthouse office. And anyway, it was nice because London tech community is small and you bump into people you know and they're like, what? How do you know these guys? Or how do you know these guys? Or why are you here? And it always leads to the same thing. And yeah, it was great, but highly recommend you guys go and check out the browser. We'll let your trial of the product do the talking, but we're incredibly excited and supportive of these guys and where they're going to take things. So yeah, that's that. And I'm getting old, so I can't be staying out till late like that anymore.
You're the one who was telling me to stay out late. I wanted to get the cab home. You were like, no, let's get clubbing. That was you.
Well, no, I said let's go to Davidoff London, not clubbing. But I am an irrational optimist when it comes to nights out, which is why I haven't done a night out in several years. But anyway, moving on to more important things.
No,
what
it's not more important.
What are we discussing today?
There's an interesting article that's been put out by Dror Poleg, Dror Poleg, on the 10th of September. And it's about Andreessen Horowitz and how they are completely reworking what it means to be a venture firm. Now, not necessarily based on what they're selling, because typically they're doing the same things. However, it's the additional services that they're doing on top. The article's called Andreessen Pulls a Bezos. And what that's referencing is the fact that Bezos was a master strategist. And Andreessen is now doing, A16Z as a firm are now shifting strategy a little bit to provide services beyond the typical investment services that you'd see. And it builds the story in the backdrop of a really interesting backdrop of, in different industries, there are different methods of competition. For example, Hilton versus Airbnb. They're not competing on the same levels, right? They're doing different things, and that's why strategically they can differ. However, when you get 2 forms of Airbnb emerging, then those 2 things will end up competing at a much harder level. Competition becomes tough, right, in those scenarios. Venture is going through the same thing. There's so many people in venture at the minute. There's so many angels, but also companies, venture funds that have emerged, that now a new form of strategy is taking place. And A16Z is leading that charge, because what are they doing? They're doing services like founder support. They're doing things like actually helping run the business financially, commercially, technically, bringing on people. They're supporting in the hiring process. It's a really short article, but it basically gets to the core of why A16Z is probably the most successful venture fund.
We've seen from the last few months how aggressive they've gone on several fronts. One noticeable being the media front, where they appointed Sriram Krishnan, I believe it was, as a partner, purely down to he was doing some exceptional stuff online in terms of just writing and hosting Clubhouse interviews with his wife. That's not even scratching the surface of what A16Z is doing. So the article, which we'll link, is fantastic because it touches on exactly as you said, property, which is something I have experience in. And it says how a world of scarcity becomes a world of abundance, but most landlords don't notice and continue to do the same old things, because obviously property is there's limited land, so it's kind of like a zero-sum game. The landlords continue to do the same old things, hoping they can win by simply doing them better, just like in the good old days. Same thing is now happening in venture, but faster. World is awash with capital, and even the most conservative institutional and retail investors are developing an appetite for riskier bets. And it just goes on and on, but how do you compete in such a world? And exactly as you touched on, which is you think strategically. It means you do things your competitors are not doing, which right now, realistically, me and you, we look at every venture firm. I mean, what really do they do differently? And we've got friends with VC-backed startups, and you hear about the array of different investors that they all have on board. What's the differentiating factor here? Like, realistically, most of them throw capital and that's it, they go on your way. Some give a little bit of good advice, but for A16Z, they have been on a hiring spree, recruiting new partners and former government officials, writers, editors, and more. And they're no longer building a VC firm, it's building a new type of company with, as they say, a thick management layer that provides extra support to its multiple portfolio companies with marketing, legal, lobbying, technical resources. And they say it's no longer a venture capital, it's a venture corporation. By doing this, put yourself in the shoes of a founder, it becomes more attractive and valuable to entrepreneurs, and it increases the likelihood. And there will be a network effect as well, actually, of all the portfolio companies that have succeeded as a result of the support. And kind of like how early YC batch, all the startups sign up to each other's product, you'll see something on a larger scale happening here, in my view. I mean, what do you think? The article discusses, does this mean A16Z will soon go bust? I want to get your views. I think no, purely because I sound like a broken record at this point, but since day one, my always drumming on about long-termism and my views on a few years or even decades of sacrifice for the extreme long term, which seems to be very difficult, even difficult for me to contain at times, because we live in such a fast moving environment. Regardless of how rational you are, FOMO and greed do kick in at times. But for A16Z to be playing this very long-term game, as they say, as Bezos would, it's exceptional in my view. Hopefully it pays off for them, and I'm sure it will.
A couple of things, right? So on the question around whether they're going to die, A16Z was founded in 2009. Like, it's only been through one iteration of a market, and even then, it's this bull market's been 14 years long. In the public market, so realistically it's not even taking full advantage of the whole bull market, so it's really early on in its innings. Mark Andreessen did an interview for Bloomberg recently. I don't know if you saw it, but he was talking about the first, we use this word so much, but the first principles approach to investing that they take, right? It's like, it's more about investing in the guys that are going to change markets fundamentally. And he was actually really big on blockchain and crypto generally, which is a big part of where their investments are moving. And actually they've hired a lot of crypto partners recently. But regardless of what we think of that they are taking bets across industries where they think large change is going to happen. Now that's just in the shape of their current business model. And I think the thing that this article brings out is that in order to win, you need to shift away from one business model. And it goes back to the whole, diversification of assets. Well, this is just diversification of your channels to market. And I think one of the really interesting things is the whole article is basically likening these guys to Amazon. Why? Because a really interesting quote is that Bezos famously said, "Your margin is my opportunity." Right? So what he was trying to say in that scenario is, take any profits you make in the short and medium term, right? 10-year, 20-year profits, reinvest them back in the firm to help diversify the options that the firm has and find higher margin opportunities down the line. It's exactly what Andreessen is doing. And in fact, the reason why it's going to work is because actually they're moving into a thick management layer, fine. But this thick management layer that they're creating is deploying expertise and giving them the edge in that expertise in this market that essentially makes them some form of a consulting firm as well. Not only are they going to make a shit ton of margin through the actual investments that they make, but they're actually jumping on top of those investments and creating further stacks of opportunity through those, like that initial walk in the door that you get. So what actually makes a founder want to have A16Z on their table, and probably will therefore mean that A16Z will never die, is that one, you got Mark Andreessen and Horowitz, like Ben Horowitz, like you got two elites, right, of the venture world. Immediately you get access to 1 million people through the network that those two can create for you. But then two, they can basically support you as a founder. Anything that you need doing, they will be the people to go to, and they'll be able to point you in the direction, and probably at favorable rates, and probably with enough experience that they'll know where you shouldn't go wrong. So it's a consulting house, it's a venture firm, it's everything all packaged in one, and a network.
Yeah. I mean, if they're sacrificing short and medium term capital for the sake of massive long-term gains, then kudos. And again, like as the article says, a handful of other firms will try to catch up, just how many online commerce players tried to catch up with Amazon, but they failed, and now Amazon dominates. Similarly, they expect to see this in the venture space, and a handful of smaller firms or boutique angel investors. Basically, angel investors and syndicates will live off small crumbs of deals, and the larger pieces, many of the big deals, many of the big profits will essentially go to firms like Andreessen, and all other firms will become irrelevant. I think you're going to make a joke of this because you're probably going to say take another shot, but I mention it every podcast. But when you write Lindy articles, this is what happens. You get to reference them frequently.
Even if they're not Lindy, you still reference them.
The first ever article I published on our website, Tech Markets at Irrational, rationalvc.com, I explained how a lot of partners at VC firms who would leave, they'd go and set up their own fund. They'd have a lot of success raising Fund 1 and Fund 2 because they still have a lot of the brand cash from the fund that they'd left previously, i.e. A16Z, Sequoia, whatever. But then long term, they do not achieve the same results. Funnily enough, can't recall, but we'll see if we can find it and throw it up later. Gary Tan posted something around his surprise as to how low venture returns are, VC firm returns are, and how very few even 3x their money, let alone higher. So very, very, very rare to do well in venture. And this is what shocks me as to how many freaking kids want to get in venture, because it literally has become the new IB, because they think, oh, it's just status signaling and bullshit. But true successful venture capitalists, and those that you could say that they've achieved mastery in the sense that, yes, they'll have misses, but over a long time span, they'll do better than most. They're very, very, very few of those. And you have to take your hat off to A16Z, because as you said, they've only been in this for 12 years now in this firm. And what they've achieved is remarkable. Some would disagree, but I genuinely think Sequoia is even looking at them like a little bit scared, like fucking hell. We've been around for, 40, 50 years. But you look at these guys in 12 years, what they've achieved and what they're doing now. If there was one VC firm I'm extremely bullish on, it would be A16Z. Anyway, moving on. Somewhat relevant to this, actually, you sent this to me, the Doug Leone podcast episode on Harry Stebbings' show. First time I really properly came across Doug and his philosophy and his way of thinking was his Stanford interview, which is on YouTube, which is great.
Elite content.
Elite. And the reason I love this guy, Doug, is because similar to me, I mean, he comes from an immigrant family, sort of lower socioeconomic background or whatever. Got his start in sales in a major city like New York. Very dog eat dog. He didn't grow up technical, and he in the interview with Harry, he talks about weightlifting and a bunch of other shit. So pretty much sounds like like a much older version of me and way more successful. But what do you make of that? Because in that interview, he discussed a lot of Sequoia's philosophies or rationale around how they do things. And you compare that to what we just discussed with A16Z. Like, what do you make of this whole thing?
Really interesting podcast. I think there's two reasons why I thought it was really interesting. The first was the way the podcast was set up worked really well. So if anyone doesn't know Harry Stebbings, if you're listening to this podcast, you probably have heard of Stebbings, but he's quite a young guy, right? He started out making podcasts. I don't know, he's made like 3,000 podcasts in the last 7 years. So the guy has been putting in work, and he has built a great network during that period, but he's still relatively young. I think he's 24, 25, right? And he's got his own venture fund now, or syndicate or something. Stebbings uses that to his kind of benefit, because he becomes the student in his questioning while Doug is like the teacher. And it's such a brilliant conversation with nuggets of brilliance in there. And the nuggets of brilliance is the second thing I want to talk about, which is the way that Doug would correct a lot of the questions that Harry would ask. And those are things like saying, Harry was literally using terminology like, okay, what are your returns? What investment are you going to make? What deal are you going to do? And all of this stuff. And Doug kept saying, no, we don't think of it like this. And what emerged to me from listening to it is that a lot of the bullshit bingo, the venture bingo that has emerged over the last maybe 20 years around, we don't do deals, we have partners, we don't work with startups, we work with founders and their teams, all of this stuff, we work with businesses. A lot of the terminology was driven by Doug, but also Don Valentine, who was the founder and essentially the OG of OGs in venture. And the really big takeaway I took away from that second point is that they have a very traditionalist, and this sounds ridiculous even saying it out loud, they have a traditionalist approach to venture capital. Sequoia is very much the Goldman Sachs, the JP Morgan of your venture world, and that came across in the way that he would discuss a lot of the opportunities that they had, and it also came away in the way that he rebutted a lot of what is currently happening in venture, which, Stebbings asked him about, what do you think of Tiger and SoftBank? And you have to ask these types of questions to these guys because they've been around for so long.
Insert lots of gunshot sounds right now. Shots fired.
And it's quite interesting because unlike Mark Andreessen, who's only been leading running a leading firm, I should say, for 10, 12 years, this guy, Doug, has been around for multiple swings and roundabouts of this market. I hate to say it, but it was a very Warren Buffett-like approach to venture, which was
Bingo.
Exactly, sit back, look at this from a higher lens. And what you actually realize is that he said it in a very polite way, but it was that, pouring money into companies doesn't necessarily bring you the value that working with someone like Sequoia does, because much like what A16Z is doing, and they're creating beyond the traditional venture firm, the support that sits around that, that's exactly what Sequoia are doing as well. He actually mentioned one of their partners that helped grow one of their partners, from a $30 million per year business to $3 billion a year.
He referenced a couple of reputable and large VC firms from, I believe it was around the year 2000 in the tech bubble that happened back then, the dot-com bubble, and how they are no longer relevant, but back then they were supposedly very relevant. And he said, then we saw that with SoftBank a few years ago, shots fired. He said, now we're seeing that with Tiger. So, but he says, we've been around for all the cycles. So, and Tiger, because he, as you said, he rebutted the things that Stebbings was saying. He said, look, we don't look at it as deal, or deploy. Companies like Tiger are just doing deploy. If you're firing 5 checks in 5 days, for example, you're not offering exactly the same benefits that we do. You kind of look at that as, okay, well, what we just discussed with A16Z, how they're building several arms or several divisions to benefit their portfolio companies. How is that going to impact Sequoia's model in the long term? Is Sequoia going to follow that model as well? But then you can argue they kind of always have had that model, in the sense that they may not have specific divisions or hiring a bunch of external players to the venture world to help portfolio companies, but they've already been doing that anyway, because when you have such a long track record, such expertise that only compounds, and the power of compounding that we always talk about, that over the long haul, it becomes another model. And A16Z cannot compete with the Sequoia model purely off of just time, purely off of compounding. They are in no way ever going to match that, because they are behind. So Andreessen, obviously, again, as you said, from first principles, they say, how are we going to solve for this? They're doing their own model, which I think is going to pay off and be successful in their own right. But Sequoia, if they just keep doing what they've always been doing, by the nature of compounding, by the nature of experience and what they learn within the firm that they pass down to junior members, and the values they've developed that Doug was talking about, great contrast, and I think both work. And I think it was a great episode.
The other thing I want to raise that you mentioned that was really, really good was how different Mark Andreessen is from Doug Leone. If you had to pick two OGs of the space, those are OGs, two of the best in the space. Those are two that come quite high up. Doug Leone is just old school Italian, raised in a tough household. The guy is just very, very different to what you'd see traditionally in what you like to call the woo-woo leftist sort of thing that's emerging out of venture. And also, it's something that Delian for Founders Fund tweeted recently, where he said, how can you be leftist but a venture capitalist? Capitalist is literally in the name, so how can you be both? And Doug, and a really interesting thing in that interview is Doug Leone kept saying stuff like, oh, I'm probably going to get cancelled for this, or I probably shouldn't say it like this, or probably should say this in a different way. So he was also subconsciously or maybe even consciously thinking these things. Yeah, if you want to model yourself off someone in venture, he's an OG to do it.
I just love the authenticity.
Yeah.
This is why I said, like, we fucking relate, because he's someone I definitely look up to in the space, in the sense that his philosophies, his way of thinking, his authenticity, which is very rare. No bullshit, says it as it is, keeps it real, lifts weights. Guy is just complete package. So, yeah. And like, going back to your point, we've discussed this in the previous episode, how when youngsters come to us through Minority in Tech, our community, and they ask for advice, or I want to get into venture, and we say it's a game of sales and marketing, not a game of technicality. Doug is the perfect example of it's a game of sales and marketing. And sometimes, some people can develop imposter syndrome because they look at Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz's achievements in their early career, and you're like, fuck, these guys are super technical, super bright. Like, if you go back and what they've developed, and Netscape and all the other things they've done, both technical, you're like, okay, I stand no chance in becoming a future VC or A16Z or whatever. But then you look at a Doug Leone, and some would argue, okay, that's an old venture model in that you could get in with hustle and sales and marketing. Nowadays, as people will say, I'm a hypocrite, because in a very early episode, me and you said the future of venture in 20, 30 years from now, basically those who run the industry will be those who have been operators, and specifically those who have at least some technical experience. I still stand by that, but it doesn't mean you need 2-3 decades of technical experience. Even 2-3 years before you go into more business or commercial roles is enough. Just because you have an awareness, and it means in hiring and deploying and whatever, you're going to have awareness. No one's going to bullshit you. I hear time and time again from friends in hiring that engineers bullshit them, or even when they hire an engineer, they're like, how long is this going to take? And the engineer's like 4 weeks. But then once they've developed technical understanding, they're like, no, it's fucking not. It's going to take 1 week and you're going to do it. And the engineer's like, yeah, actually, I can turn it around in 1 week. So technical awareness is key, but long haul macro, it's still a game of sales and marketing. Take a shot. As Naval says, he says, learn to build, learn to sell, but he says, learn to build early in your career. Long term, it's like pretty much in your 20s, early 30s, whatever, mid 30s, learn a bit of building. But long term, it's always a game of sales and marketing. Sales is everything. You want to discipline your kids, it's sales, it's influence. You want to pick up someone in a bar, it's sales. You want to convince someone to join your company, it's everything is just sales. So I love Doug Leone, and in modern day venture, it'll be good to supplement the Doug Leone way with a couple of years at least of technical awareness, but beyond that, it's always sales and marketing.
I like that, because it leads on to the next subject that we want to talk about quite nicely, which is, the learn to build, learn to sell model makes a lot of sense, but to learn to build has different things and different ways of thinking about it. And one of those is your level of technical expertise, but it's also around expertise in general, right? So what is it that you need to specialize in, and how should you specialize in that thing? And there's this really good article on the A16Z website called 21 Experts on the Future of Expertise. And they interview 21 contributors that have spoken about what they have used in their come up for building their own brand and building their expertise in specific areas. It includes people like Matt Clifford, who wrote the article, who is the co-founder and CEO of Entrepreneur First in the UK. You've also got the co-founder of Substack, Hamish McKenzie, on it, and the ever-present name in venture and the investing world, Packy McCormick now, who's the writer of the Not Boring newsletter. So there's loads of people, and they talk about really interesting personal takes on what expertise of the future looks like. And I wanted to get your view on what you think the coolest or most interesting nugget from that piece is.
For me, really, to sum it up, it was Matt Clifford's. We'll link it, see if we can throw up a screenshot, distinguishing between contrarians and cranks. It's discussing in modern day, and he says the internet prizes showing and not telling. So whether it's a GitHub profile, a YouTube channel, a Substack newsletter, whatever it is, it's proof of work. It's don't tell me you're an expert, show me. So there's fewer gatekeepers, more participants, and we all know this, and this is why we're in this space and we freaking love it, because it goes against all the bullshit of traditional corporations and the institution and bureaucracy and all of that bullshit. Anyway, there is an issue, however, with all of this amazing stuff that we talk about comes a lot of problems as well. And what I mean by that is the immense amount of misinformation you can say that comes with, because we discussed this on our previous pod, why I do long breaks from Twitter, because it's overwhelming. Like, you get on there, as you scroll in the space of 30 seconds, you've consumed the thoughts of 100 people, like just by scrolling really fast or skimming. And that's horrific. Why the fuck would you want to do that? Thinking as the goats, Munger, Buffett, they would sit and think slowly and for long periods of time about one particular topic until you understand it deeply and properly. You can come up with your own thoughts around it, your own judgment before you move on to the next thing. You research it well, you come up with your own judgment. But to just take nuggets constantly, and most of it which is just made up, it's not scientific fact, it's just a dude's opinion behind his keyboard. And most, these are all my views, by the way, not Matt, but most of these tweets are believed by most people in the sense that, oh, the person has clout or they have a bit of following, so that must mean it's facts, and they model their whole life or their way of thinking. And this is why there's mental health problems at an all-time high, especially in Gen Z and millennials, because they're trying to model themselves off of a highlight reel and just the bullshit people spurt out as soon as they think it online. So it's all very fucking dangerous in my view, and I've talked about this a million times before, and the incredible work that Cal Newport has done in his books, Deep Work and A World Without Social Media and Digital Minimalism, and all of this stuff that he's written in books or blogs. But to sum it up, Matt Clifford's point of people they claim to be experts or they come across as experts, but this raises two important questions on the future of expertise. First, how do we build better intuitions and norms around when to rely on traditional expertise and when to look further afield? And second, how do we build better tools and institutions for, just distinguishing contrarian and correct from quote unquote crank? So the two will often look similar, as I just said, as he points out, but the former might sometimes and literally save the world. This is very important, especially in like talking about COVID-19 pandemic and predictions that have been made. It's very dangerous. You're literally messing with people's lives. So prediction markets and super forecasting communities are good starting points, as Matt says, but there is much, 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 much more to be built. And it takes, unusual ideas seriously without falling for all of them. That will be one of the great challenges of this century. I've always said it's going to be very challenging, and this is why all we can do as consumers is be very conscious. It's difficult, but of our usage. Maybe read some Cal Newport, read it every year to remind yourself and execute on those strategies. Beyond that, hats off to anyone trying to solve this through technology or any other means.
It's an interesting point because it's actually raised by another guy on this blog called Jacob M. Changama. Jacob M. Changama says that bullshit exists a lot in what we would term expertise today. And so it's excellence, not affiliation, that makes expertise. And what he means by that is that
beautiful.
You can't really always assume that anything you hear or see is accurate. And Packy McCormick says this as well in his blog, which is always test people's opinions and use them as inputs. Even if they are the foremost expert and you know that they're the foremost expert, still only use it as an input and weigh it up against other things and test its expertise, test the output. This specific writing from Mchangama basically says that hand-wringing about the evils of an increasingly egalitarian public sphere is often driven by elite panic, in inverted commas, in which traditional gatekeepers seem at least as concerned with the eroding authority and relevance of their own privileged access to the public than with concerns about the common good. Now, to put that in English, because that's beautifully written, to put that in simple English, it's a beautiful point that bureaucracy surrounds a lot of these changes, and bureaucracy surrounds a lot of what we would term expertise, when in fact it's more just a prevention or a security mechanism for those people that exist within that bureaucratic framework. A great example that exists outside of the world of venture is the economist Thomas Sowell, who is famously a right-leaning economist, who says that the only reason that we don't have truth or we don't have egalitarian economics and politics is because there is so much bureaucratic gatekeeping that exists. And so if you were to make things a little bit freer, all of those bureaucrats would fall out of jobs, and they are not incentivized to do so. And this links beautifully back to this point that Jacob and Changama is raising. So yeah, that's the point around expertise. It's just like, find the right person, forget all the noise, forget all the bullshit, test that against other people that you think are experts or even not experts, and come up with your own opinion about expertise, and then publish that in a way that is leveraging it for your own sake.
It goes back to the last podcast when I said there's a lot of tech bros that take the piss out of people like us. There's this meme with the normal distribution chart, and in the middle is the really stressed guy, and it's like, oh, mental models, decision making, judgment. But it's like, yeah, I fucking put a huge emphasis on those things. Call me the guy in the middle, call me low IQ, I don't give a shit. I am the guy in the middle when it comes to those topics, because fucking hell, learn, like, critical thinking is key, good judgment, good decision making, it's everything. I model it off Munger basically, and if you don't like it, fuck you. Anyway, moving on before we wrap up. Before we wrap up to the final couple of topics, quick ones. One is Sam Parr of The Hustle and My First Million Pod. He put up this tweet which said, throw it up, download numbers for some of our recent podcast episodes. Number 1, growing a pod is hard as hell. 2, but when it works, it's amazing. 3, I thought we'd be at 100,000 downloads per episode by now. And 4, these numbers feel small, but I'm amazed at how many people know of the pod, so they're not that bad. And you look at the pod and their last, 10 episodes or whatever, averaging around 43 to 45k downloads per episode. And this is literally top charting. I think they're top 5 or top 10 or whatever in the business or tech podcasts. And the reason that we're discussing this is because Iman sent this to me, and Iman said, oh, it's great that we're also publishing on YouTube. I mean, we get, like, compared to YouTube, we get good now. We usually get more downloads on audio, I say, than we get on YouTube, maybe slightly more. But overall, accumulatively, it's a few hundred plays, anywhere from 300 to 1,000 downloads per episode, depending on how much it blows. Some a bit more, some a bit less, but usually it's that range. And the reason we're discussing this is because a lot of people ask us around content creation, and there was a thread last year posted by Gary Tan or someone else who said, sorry, it wasn't Gary Tan, I think it was one of the guys from the Morning Brew podcast who said, what's the best method to grow on publishing online media? Is it a podcast or is it YouTube? And Gary Tan and everyone else in the industry came back and said YouTube. Why? Because YouTube, the algorithm works for you. Yes, you have to be consistent. Yes, you have to publish consistently. But if you're putting in the work, after a while, the YouTube algorithm works in your favor and it will bring in at least a few views for you. Whereas podcast audio has almost zero discoverability. There's no algorithm that will favor you. The only way to really win in podcasts is to go extremely aggressive like Harry Stebbings and do 2,800 plus episodes in 6 or 7 years. Beyond that, for people like us who do not do it as a career, it's a side hobby, side project, that's not achievable, and the best discoverability is YouTube. Sahil once said on a Clubhouse that he knows some of the top best podcasters and they don't bring in impressive downloads on audio, as we just see Sam Parr posted as well. So for anyone who wants to publish content, writing is great, but if you want to put a voice out there, I'd say YouTube. But that's why we do audio and video. It takes a lot of time for a side project. But I say, and I want to get your thoughts on this, I think regardless, if you're a podcast nowadays, you have to be on YouTube unless you have very early mover advantage like Stebbings years ago, which you don't. So you have to also publish the video format on YouTube, the audio format on audio publishing platforms. Audio only is not great. Sam Parr's one of the best pods in the industry, and he only gets 40k, 45k downloads per episode.
He's not even in the industry. Like, he is one of the biggest. My First Million is one of the biggest pods in the world. It's like the world. Yeah. It's like one of the biggest business pods. So I think it is the biggest business pod. So like, if this guy is doing 50k, and then you go and watch any Tom, Dick, and Harry can get 2 million views for throwing cash in the sky on YouTube, and the fact that the YouTube algorithm pays you for that, you monetize off YouTube, it just makes it a complete non-starter. And if I were anyone that's looking to do a side hobby, there are, like you say, the two things are YouTube and writing, but the two actually go hand in hand, because you have to write to be able to do YouTube as well. So kind of a form of copy, if you will. And so like from that perspective, like you learn, it's a balancing act. You learn both. Yeah.
And what I've learned is writing brings in, if your long-term aim is to raise a bit of money from LPs like Paki with Not Boring, the newsletter, you attract the intellectuals or those with money or those who are a bit older and more mature and experienced in their career, specifically with the writing. But YouTube is more for attracting the younger crowds, the Gen Zs, the millennials. Dare I say it, not all, but most are a bit more fickle, shorter attention span. So that's how it works. But I think being on both, you capture both markets. And yeah, anything else before we wrap up?
No, but I don't like going back to doing this online. I'd like to be in person again. It was so much more fun seeing your face and wanting to punch you actually in person.
We will reunite soon. It's just because of fitting this around work schedules and circumstances.
Reunited and it feels so good.
Yeah, I think next episode will probably be in person or the one after, but we're going to have a bunch going to be in person from October onwards. And yeah, maybe have your earplugs ready because I'm going to be talking a lot. So and soundproof your walls or whatever. Coming to a neighborhood near you soon.
Gunshots.
And make sure you have some chicken and broccoli in your fridge ready for me with kombucha.
Jesus Christ. All right, man.
Absolute meme. Okay, rationalvc.com. Find all the free essays. We do not publish every essay on there, but we publish a few. If you want the rest of them, you subscribe to the newsletter, which is free, rationalvc.com. It probably won't be free forever. It should not be free right now, but hey, it is. So here's my wheeler dealer. Go and grab yourself a bargain. rationalvc.com. And that's it. Anything else?
We'll see you on the next one.
We out. Peace.